I've been looking very much forward to this, both from a 50 by 40 perspective and from a personal perspective, because as all of us here on the call, we are movement builders and also in many ways diplomats or coalition builders. And the essence of a good coalition or a good network is to find grounds for commonality, finding ways to collaborate. And that is the kind of like the essence of what this issue of the hot topics, and particularly the debate today, is based on. So I'm very happy to introduce the two speakers here today. And let me just briefly mention why those are the ones who are here. Well, today we're going to be talking about alternative protein market versus voices for food sovereignty. What is that about? Well, the idea for this has been a long time coming. And again, this is something that's been discussed a lot in the movement, the necessity to break down barriers and collaborate better. Within 50 by 40, we have kind of a microcosmos of the wider movement. So we have organizations that's very focused on market-driven economy and market-driven theory of change. Others are focused exclusively on social justice and equity and food sovereignty issues. We, of course, believe, as you know, we all do, that these things are interlinked and we can find the best way forward. However, often we get into a conversation of like, what is the best way forward? Do we have time to really engage everybody across the movements, or is urgency dictating that we have to move quickly in the ways that quickest way takes us to concrete results? All of this is going to be discussed more, and I just mentioned this to make sure that you understand the essence of who we've chosen today and why we've chosen them. So a warm welcome to Varun and Ajay. So Varun, as the screen says here, is the Managing Director of the Good Food Institute India, and has a great background working with scientists, foundation, governments, and so forth, and also has already put his mark on the movement in India, and he's been mentioned one of India's 25 most influential young citizens. Speaking together with Varun is Ajay. Ajay, whom is one of the leading voices within food and farming in India as well, and also a practicing farmer himself. Has been engaging in food and farming forum for many years, and also was deeply engaged in the UN Food System Summit last year, where I also had the pleasure of working closely with Ajay. And Ajay is also known for always speaking his mind, which was practiced a lot during the Food System Summit, which I really appreciated, because it was always good when nobody else wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. Ajay was always ready to do that. So I think these two distinguished speakers today are going to be helping us to have a really good dialogue. Next slide, please. So that is the kind of the introduction to the topic today. So without further ado, I will be handing over first to Varun to give his presentation for 7 minutes. After that, we will have Ajay speak, and then we will have a curated conversation between the two, where we have a very honest conversation about what the main issues and what the constraints and the points of collaboration are for issues related to alternative meat production and to food sovereignty. So Varun, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for being in attendance as well. I'm going to quickly go into a slideshow here and jump in because I have a limited amount of time. As we all know, we're here to talk about rebuilding food systems, and I'm putting forward the proposition that alternative protein is one of the great pillars for a smarter food supply, not just in the West, but also in the global majority regions of the world, including South Asia, which is where I've done most of my work to build the alternative protein sector. I'm going to start off. Firstly, I work for the Good Food Institute. We're a network of organizations that builds this space across science, business, and policy. I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but I'm going to set a little bit of context at the beginning here. I think the issues that all of us care about and why we're assembled here today stem from this big question: how we're going to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050. It's worth noting that 1/6 of those people will still be in India in 2050. The majority of people will be in the global south. That's why it's called the global majority as it is today. Of course, population growth rates do lead to significant pressures on the planet, right? So just underlining some of the challenges that we face here in India, we have significant challenges of undernutrition, or I should say malnutrition, which includes diseases of affluence as well as diseases of impoverishment, right? And these include iron deficiency anemia, neural tube defects brought about by folic acid deficiencies, etc., etc. The point being that these can be quite debilitating and they can rob our population's ability to shape its own destiny, which is particularly critical because we're going to be, at least in India, the most populous country in the world next year. And that these are issues that really rob us of what we've been calling our demographic dividend all these years, right? We also have a huge farmer family cohort, and of course, Mr. Ajay Jhakar can speak with great authority to this. 50% of our population is reliant on agriculture, and a significant portion of that 50% is subsistence agriculture. And this group is the most vulnerable to climate change because of the quality of the soil, because of the availability of water, etc., etc. And then finally, we have seen over the last couple of years, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the impacts that significant shocks can have on vulnerable populations, right? So we've seen essentially pandemic refugees in this part of the world. And climate change is going to look no different. In fact, it already does look no different. So coming back to this big question of feeding 10 billion people by the year 2050, as we all know and why we are all here today, unfortunately, our current food supply is untenable, right? We cannot continue with business as usual if we are going to feed all of these people sustainably, efficiently, and safely. And the reason that the Good Food Institute focuses on animal protein as a key area of work is because it is a significant contributor to these challenges that we all face. So I'm not going to jump into each of these things here today because I know that many in the audience already know all of these things, but just to pick a couple of things here. Industrial animal agriculture, that is the large-scale, intensive, industrialized farming and slaughter of animals, as well as deep-sea fishing and trawling, etc. It's responsible for more climate change than the entire emissions from the transportation sector combined, right? The resource burdens that intensive industrial animal agriculture places on the planet are particularly important in a place like India, where we already have 600 million Indians living under extreme water stress. And then, of course, we also have the challenges of food safety, where low and middle income countries, of course, which form most of the global majority, account for about 41% of the global population, but 75% of our foodborne illness-related deaths. So we suffer in much greater proportion due to the vulnerability of our food systems in this part of the world. So whatever we try to build leading into 2050 and between now and then should, of course, account for all of these factors and be focused on sustainability and safety. But everything I'm saying now has been known for decades, right? It's been proposed for decades that we should step down our consumption of animal protein and switch from chicken to chickpeas or beef to broccoli or mutton to mung beans, but it simply doesn't work, right? In fact, a significant portion of the growth in demand for meat and eggs and dairy is coming from places like South Asia, where meat is seen as a prestige food, where incomes continue to rise and where naturally these challenges that therefore come with industrial farming are going to only step up in intensity and in number. So our solution is smart protein. That's what we call alternative proteins in India. What we're saying is, if we provide solutions that taste the same or better and cost the same or less, and particularly which fit into the operating model of the global majority, we will be able to provide a viable solution that enables people to make a simple switch and not a sacrifice. And that simple switch needs to come not just for consumers, but also on the supply side. I think most would know this by now, but these smart proteins come in various forms: plant-based proteins, fermentation-derived proteins, cultivated proteins, and these have a different timeline and different challenges. They present different challenges in terms of locating within the global majority context, right? I'm not going to dwell on all of this, but we can certainly discuss this later. The point is that as we think about locating this exciting new technology sector within the global majority context, there are several promising reasons why it might work very well, because it fits in with major strategic priorities for the global majority in terms of advancing certain kinds of agriculture and allied development, of course, in terms of achieving the sustainable development goals and in achieving nutrition security as well. All of these materials we'd be happy to share afterwards, but we've done intensive life cycle analyses and techno-economic analyses that show the order of magnitude difference between producing these products versus conventional intensively farmed animal products. We've seen, for instance, that all of the progress that's been made in this sector has actually come thus far on a shoestring budget relative to adjacent sectors like renewable energy, which are, as of now, locating themselves in the developing world context. So if you look at the screen there, for instance, about $11 billion has been invested in the alternative protein or smart protein sector globally in the last 11 years, but that pales in comparison to the nearly $2 trillion that's been invested in renewable energy, and rightly so. So this is the level we should be aspiring to. And of course, from a market development standpoint and the potential to develop the economy in places like India, the projections for alternative proteins are very high from all of these folks who do these things on a daily basis. What I will say is that the opportunity here is underpinned by several factors that lead to an advantage for places like India. We do have large crop biodiversity in agroclimatic zones. We have a globally competitive talent pool, and we have this major industrial opportunity that's already growing in adjacent industries like biomanufacturing. If we're able to get it right, we might be able to create a significant market, as I was mentioning earlier. But I will say, perhaps the most heartening piece here is that we're probably going to be able to create, with the right investment, a huge number of jobs in this part of the world as well. Now, the question that we're going to debate, of course, is a just transition and how to actually locate within this context. But it is definitely true that investing in these sectors will create resilient jobs. Other countries are already doing this, and the global majority actually, at this point, remains at risk of being left behind unless we do this in lockstep with countries like Singapore, the US, Israel, and China. What's already been happening is investment has lagged behind in countries like India relative to the rest of the world. So even that $11 billion I was mentioning earlier, a very tiny, minuscule amount of that has come in India. And just to wrap up, an example of the kind of investment that needs to take place in places like India is quite different from the rest of the world. We need to invest in R&D, in locating within the unique operating model of agriculture with smallholders, with indigenous crops in places like India. We need to understand some of our pressures on the agronomy side, on the specific characteristics of the crops like pulses, like millets. We have a great deal of institutional knowledge. Universities like the Indian Institute of Millets Research, the International Crops Research for the Semi-Arid Tropics, and a number of different ecosystem actors, including Mr. Ajay Jhakar's groups, who are doing really great work to advance indigenous agriculture in places like India. But we do need to invest across the entire value chain to fully realize the potential of a budding new industry like alternative proteins. And if we're able to do that, we could really create a very productive flywheel and a pillar of our new green economy. But once again, not without concerted effort in a number of different areas from actors across the realms of business, science, and policy. So I'll stop there. I know it was a bit of a whirlwind. I don't know if I went over time, but I remain open to answer any questions. And of course, I remain available to answer questions after this as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Varun, and really interesting presentation and important points. And I'm personally very interested in hearing a little bit more about the LCA of the financial aspect, and particularly looking at the aspects of circular economy versus traditional measures of success and growth like the GDP and the changes we're seeing. So that's something I think for the Q&A and for the curated discussion between you and Ajay would be quite interesting to get into. And for those who have questions coming up, I see there's already coming something in on Slido. Please do put the questions in there and we'll make sure we get to them in the Q&A. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ajay and your presentation.
Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you can hear me, Lasse. Can you hear me?
Clearly, thank you.
Okay. So thank you for this opportunity to 50 by 40 and Lasse for having me here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to hear to views presented by Varun. I think it's difficult to disagree with what he's saying. There is space for all kinds of foods, and there's a huge gap where alternate proteins can also add to the solutions that we're looking at. But at the onset, I would also want to say very much upfront that framing of a statement in the mail that I got which said food sovereignty is about governance of production of food rather than access to food, I think so is misleading, because they're not different sides of uh, food sovereignty. Is also about access to food. It's about governance and access to food, and both those things are directly proportional to each other. So control of markets, which is about governance of food, is directly proportional of how food is accessible to all or not. And I'll just take, I do not have a presentation like Varun, but I will just read out some facts I picked up from some articles. In the seed sector, 10% of companies control 73% of the market. In agrochemicals, it's 5 companies control 84%. In farm machinery, it's 10 companies which control 65%. In fertilizers, 10 companies control around 30%. Animal pharmaceuticals, 10 companies control 75% of the market share. Agriculture commodities, 10 firms own 90% of the organized worldwide trade share. Food and beverage, again, 10 companies control 90% of organized international trade in food and beverages. Now, to better understand the concentration of power on the ground, let's look at the coffee trade. When farm gate prices of coffee fell from 1997 to 2002 by 80%, the retail price only dropped by 27%, while profits of Starbucks rose 41%, of Nestle 20%. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that concentration of power in a few hands, governance of food, space is directly linked to access to food. If we were to discuss, and any rational discussion would agree that concentration of power, especially related to food, is something that is unquestionable. Anyone who questions, I think personally, anyone who questions that concentration of power in a few hands, especially in the food sector, does not have a relation with access to food is like, it's like a climate change denier today. People who say there's no climate change, I would put them in the same category. Yes, food sovereignty is also about dismantling monopolies and concentration of power. The other sovereignty problem that I see is in agriculture research, which is equally important. It's not only about the market share. Now, eight seed and biotech companies control 76% of all research and development spending in that area. For agrochemicals, 5 companies control 74% of the research and development budgets that's going in. For farm machinery, 4 companies have 57%. For animal health, it's 8 companies have 66% of the research and development budget. And what is even more worrisome, Lasse, is the one CGIR. Now, this is funded by an individual and his personal whims, and he will be deciding the fate of millions of people, billions of people on the planet, of how agriculture research is structured. And this is what I'm against. And this is what my organization and many organizations in the civil society are continuously raising issues that power must not concentrate in a particular person's hands. I was I was the vice chair of Action Track 2 on sustainable consumption, and in one of the discussions, not in Action Track 2, it was in another session, I had proposed on backyard poultry and kitchen gardens as an approach to, and I was asked to substantiate my suggestion with data. So when we try to find the data in the FAO annual report, we found, let me quote, home gardening and production for home consumption are vastly undocumented, so the impact is largely unknown, unquote. So this is exactly what I'm saying. Even research is now controlled by a few people, by a few corporate houses. And that is the worrisome part. The number of hungry people in the world are over 800 million. If you look at how money is flowing, if you look at Africa, millions and billions of dollars have flown into Africa over 20 years to make them self-sufficient. They've not become self-sufficient because the governance of the space of food is creating problems which deny people self-sufficiency and access to food which is grown in their local areas, counties, in their own countries. So basically, this is what I'm trying to connect, that food sovereignty is directly connected to governance, which is directly responsible for access. And as organizations, as farmer organizations, we are looking that primary producers are able to attain dignified livelihoods. When we come to alternate proteins, which I will come to a little later, this is where we come in. So if we were to make this shift, how would dignified livelihoods still be made available to people who are dependent on animals and animal husbandry? I think there is space for everything other than industrial animal farming, for which obviously I'm in complete agreement with what Varun just said. We need to change consumption choices. We need to reduce meat consumption in affluent countries and continents like Europe and North America, which are consuming far more than they should be consuming. But as Varun very clearly pointed out, rightly pointed out, as economies expand, demand for red meat will further outstrip demand. And this is because this is not only is it required for the health, as a protein requirement for the health, but also it's an aspirational food that people, as they become more affluent, they will want to eat more of such things. And so with alternate proteins, I'm in complete agreement that there is space for alternate proteins. Investments must come into this sector. But at the same time, let me put a caveat here that one of the big problems with industrial farming is not that they're only destroying the environment and the biodiversity and so many other consequences that come out of it, but it's the governance of the food space that the big corporates control, the monopolies that they control. And with alternate protein also, that is the worry, that it will be controlled by a few companies, by a few corporate houses, and that itself will have disastrous consequences. So industrial farming, yes, it has environmental consequences, but here we are talking about control. So all I'm trying to say is, again and again, is that we cannot differentiate between what is about governance of food, about control of the value chain, and also about the environment. I think so they're all interconnected. Even if we were to do an assessment of alternate proteins which are available in the market or which will come into being, it'll all come down to research. Whose research is it? Who's funding that research? When you remove the wheel of secrecy, where does the money come from? So those are issues I want to put on the table. Even animal husbandry companies like Tyson Foods have now invested in alternate proteins. And so it's a space that needs to be governed. It's a space that needs to have transparency. It's a space that needs more clarity. And that should be a part. We should not just be focusing on the outcomes, let's say, we should also be focusing on the process that leads to the outcomes that we will be in disagreement with. I'll just leave it at that right now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ajay, for your thoughts and for your very interesting and scary facts as well. And I think it's so important to make some of the distinctions you're bringing up here. And I remember during the Food Systems Summit, you were very keen on this, bringing forward the understanding of the difference between the true cost of food and the true value of food, the latter being what really engages the farmer's perspective as well and brings prosperity and decency to farmer voices. So I thought, maybe I could just help frame a first question to get this debate off the ground, because the idea is for the two of you to kind of engage in a conversation as if you were sitting over a coffee or a glass of wine or whatever you prefer, and talking this through and having an honest conversation, because that's what we want to do with the hot topics. We want to break down the barriers and then get into it in this kind of closed space, although this is going to be made public. So one of the things I think would be interesting to start off would be to get your perspective, Varun, what Ajay is saying, and particularly maybe zooming in on the aspect of, is there such a thing of shifting to an alternative protein market where the market share grows significantly and it really carries the farmers and the small producers with them. And within that, maybe making a differentiation between the ethical reason for doing so and the rational, strategic, financial reason for doing so. So I'll be interested in both in the cynical perspective, if this is going to work or not, and also like what is the right thing to do. So maybe some thoughts from you, Varun.
Yeah, thank you for that. Firstly, let me just say I would be delighted to have a coffee with Ajay at some point and have this conversation as well. But until that time, I'm glad to have this opportunity to have this dialogue. There are very many things on which we agree, and I think that is particularly coming from a global majority perspective, right? What I will say is that I do not believe that the alternative protein sector, as it has been constituted thus far or aimed thus far, where its roots have been in trying to replace beef burgers in a market like the US, will solve these issues by default, right? And it is logical to aim such technologies at solving the beef burger problem. I mean, Americans eat 3 beef burgers a week, which for all sorts of reasons is crazy town. I believe that's the technical term, crazy town. But for reasons of health, for reasons of environment, for reasons of concentration, as Ajay mentioned, that is all very alarming. And therefore, replacing a beef burger with a Beyond Meat burger, replacing one of those 3 beef burgers with a Beyond Meat burger in the US, on average for the entire population, essentially takes 12.2 million cars off the road or powers 2.3 million additional homes, right? So in terms of gains for the environment, etc., it makes complete sense, not even getting into the health issues of cholesterol and TMAO and all of those things. But in a place like India, some of the issues that have been raised related to concentration of power, as well as making sure that farmers and other vulnerable groups have a seat or a stake, pun very much intended, in the future of food, will not happen by default. I don't think the market will solve those things by default, right? So the operating model of the developing world skews very much more towards smallholder farming, towards cooperative models, etc., which do not necessarily exist in the West or in the global north. So those are things that we very much have to account for, and I think these are almost like parallel movements that really do need to work together. So if we are to locate new and interesting technologies like alternative proteins that have potential to transform our environmental prospects, if we're to locate them within this operating model, I think we have to work together to make those things happen. A couple of examples of how that might happen, right? I'll first start with a market-oriented perspective. A lot of what the government has been trying to do, and I'm sure Ajay would express his own feelings about the success or the point of these initiatives, has been to get farmers to move away from cash crops or rotate away from cash crops and grow more crops like millets and pulses, right? Which is a good thing theoretically, but a very hard thing to implement, because there's a training component involved. There's cash crops by default involve a minimum support price in places like India. And so farmers are very dependent on crops like rice, wheat, and sugarcane, which are really not good for their soils, for their water use, etc., etc. So getting them to grow millets and pulses is going to be difficult unless some amount of financial incentive is included, right? So alternative proteins could present one fast-growing, lucrative end market. And we're already seeing crops like mung beans or chickpeas having a very fast-growing end market in alternative proteins. So that's one market-oriented perspective where we could immediately begin integrating backwards into the agricultural supply chain, connecting companies backwards to farmers, and these could even be grown through rotation cropping, etc. These crops happen to be also nitrogen fixing, so it really is a sort of triple bottom line solution for farmers, right? But once again, there needs to be a lot of work that goes into that kind of process. The second perspective, which could be really interesting as well, is a subsistence-oriented perspective or a complete food sovereignty-oriented perspective, where some of the technologies and alternative proteins, like, for example, whole biomass fermentation, lend themselves really well to the notion of decentralized protein production, right? So none of the companies globally have yet done this on a very large scale, right? But some of the work that we've been doing has been exploring with companies if we can just, through non-IP owning, build, operate, and transfer models, initiate the decentralization of protein biomass production in places like sub-Saharan Africa and India, where local communities, including, for example, women's self-help groups, could produce protein. And then, of course, that protein would be highly nutritious and sustainable because it's fungi and other sources of protein. And then process that protein into whatever makes sense to consume locally or sell into local markets, depending on their needs. Right? So this is a subsistence-oriented perspective that could be of great interest. I'll close this portion by saying, once again, by underlining that these things do not happen without concerted effort. We don't believe that the market solves for these issues spontaneously, right? And so we are looking forward to working with groups and people, leaders like Ajay, on making these kinds of things happen, because they are intrinsically important for the welfare of the people involved in the food system, and could really lead to much better outcomes in terms of food systems, nutritively as well as sustainably.
Thank you so much, Varun, for those points. And I appreciate you make the distinction between the global north and the global majority in terms of approach. One could claim in crude terms that the former is about reversal and the latter is about prevention in some ways. That opens up a different conversation about leapfrogging and also cultural and neocolonial problems with that approach that also needs to be dealt with. Even the term leapfrogging can be very negative depending on the context. I wanted to come back to you, Ajay, and just hear your initial thoughts, and particularly to the second point of Varun about like empowering local producers and farmers to produce for local markets with given the right subsidies. Like, should we have alternative protein production taking place in each village, and how would we go about that? And would that be something you think would be a good step in the right direction?
Thank you. I think first, the very idea that alternate proteins could be produced in villages and counties and cities for local consumption, I think I would not buy that idea. Not today, not in this lifetime. Markets don't work like that. And Varun, markets are not free. Let's not be under any delusion that markets will find a place. Markets are not free. I would also want to put that there is a difference between volunteerism and there's a difference between regulation. We cannot expect volunteerism to get us an environment of business and markets that would make life, that would give access to food or give equity to everyone. I think we need very strict regulation. We need to impose penalties on those doing industrial animal farming. And those are the kinds of things that are required. It's just not giving incentives that are going to help. On the other side, we have to impose penalties, because those who are adding all the problems to the planet. Also, farmers do not grow out of choice. Farmers grow what either the government incentivizes, as Varun is saying, or farmers grow what markets demand. So I would still say, when you're looking at the protein market, we should be focusing on lesser consumption of industrial ag products. We should be focusing on changing consumption habits of the youth, of the children, and like have a 20-year plan on changing consumption habits. That should be an integral part of any effort. But having said that, as has been pointed out earlier, there is a difference between farming of smallholder farmers in Africa and in Asia, and of large industrial farms in South America or in Australia or in North America and feeding continents like Europe. Animal husbandry is an integral part of smallholder farming. It's an integral part of agroecological farming practices. So we really need to differentiate between where we draw the line between the good and the bad. Having said that, lots of people have also said that we could look at proteins coming out of grazing animals, but I don't think so that can meet the demand. So on one extreme, people are saying that we could have animals grazing, and that could meet the demand of the planet for red meat. It's not going to happen. Definitely, there is space for alternate protein, but that space needs to be strictly controlled. That space needs to be strictly regulated. We should not allow any monopolies to come up, because monopolies lead to their own cycle of distress that happens as we go ahead. One of the things that I'm not sure what Varun said, and maybe I can just ask him in this conversation, is he said that if everyone ate a vegetable meat burger, an impossible burger or whatever, in the US, cars, less fuel would be required for the cars, or cars would go off the road. I really didn't understand that point. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be nice.
Thanks a lot, Ajay. I think maybe start with the latter first, Varun, maybe just to clarify the comparison there. And then I think it would be interesting to get back to Ajay on some of his points, and particularly talk a little bit about urgency versus reality for what we have now, what we need to do, and how we can speed up the process, but still have a conversation about inclusivity as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, responding to some of the other aspects as well, I think a kind of basket of interventions is emerging here, right? So I think demand priming to reduce the demand for industrially farmed meat certainly should be part of whatever bouquet of interventions is being implemented over the next decades. I think some of the need essentially is to also diversify protein supply, right? So if we're able to get from where we are to a future where we have diverse protein supply that includes regeneratively farmed animals as well as alternative protein inputs like plant-based meats, as Ajay is saying, I think we'd be in a much better place than we are today in terms of our impacts on the planet as well as public health, etc. So we're definitely in agreement on that, but it's going to take a significant amount of work to get there. On the latter point, I think so. I mentioned Beyond Meat's life cycle analysis, which I think this should be sort of intuitively well understood, right? In terms of the resource burdens given the land, water, energy, that is non-renewable energy, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Replacing one of those 3 beef burgers that Americans eat every week on average is the equivalent of taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes from a resource burden standpoint. That's just a sort of life cycle comparison. And then lastly, I will say the point about being sort of market focused because of the scale of the challenge is well appreciated. I think there might be sort of small scale proofs of concept that are possible to build up on local and small scale fermentation, protein production, etc. But the point is well taken that we have to think much larger scale and systemic, and therefore I think reforming markets and on this side of the on the alternative protein side of the coin, trying to get much more efficient and proliferate these alternative proteins in society, I think both make sense as kind of a coordinated strategy.
Thanks a lot, Varun. Just one more thing in this, and I'll come back to Ajay, and then I want to talk a little bit about the tech, food tech side of things. But I mean, there seems to be, like, at least in the narrative, and a comparison or like an interlinkage between urgency and consolidation versus inclusivity and decentralization. Can that be broken? Is there any way of actually talking about an urgency and decentralization at the same time? And what is strategy and what is reality? Ajay, some thoughts on that, and also anything else you wanted to come back to, Varun, on?
So, Lasse, that's the political economy of food. The urgency, everybody realizes the urgency is there. And this is one of the reasons that the UN Food System Summit did not reach its logical conclusions or its potential. It's because, and you know this very clearly, it's about the pushback that came from certain countries which did not want to talk about meat, which did not want to give up those national interests that was served, financial interests that was served with corporate houses or companies based in their particular countries. I think this can only happen with greater awareness. But coming back to Varun's point about Beyond Burger, understanding its value, when you compare it to how many homes could be powered or how many cars could be fueled, I really think that leads to the other problem, which is how a narrative is based becomes equally important. When you say that it could power homes, the first thing that comes is biofuel mandates. If you're going to remove, if you're going to reduce consumption of red meat, we are looking at that not to grow biofuels. We're looking at return land to nature. That's what we're looking at. So I think it's the whole process that needs to be looked at. as I said earlier, not just the objective of shifting people out of meat consumption, but using that land to then grow fuels while people are still hungry on the planet doesn't work. We need to take a systems approach to this. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And also to Varun's point about giving incentives, how do you give incentives for practices which are beneficial for the planet and for the people? You've got to be very careful about it. For example, if we take net zero, so let's take carbon credits, for example. So rather than fine people who are adding carbon to the planet, we are allowing them to pay for it. I think the urgency requires that we stop something rather than we incentivize a slow closure over the next 50, 100 years. By the time the climate change would have happened, which is already happening, would have be irreversible. So I really think, I don't know if I can explain this properly, but how our incentives design should closely be linked with how are disincentivized structured into the regulation. It cannot just be incentives. It has to be some disincentives, some penalties structured into it. And the world, if you look, let's say, I also want to add, if you look at the world, sustainable development goals. In this, people who are listening in today, or you ask anyone in the world today, how many sustainable development goals will the planet meet when the due date is here? I'm skeptical that we may not even meet one. The first one starts off with zero hunger. We've got more people who are hungry than when we started off with these sustainable development goals. People are talking about net zero. I think so. Most people who understand the subject really understand that we're not going to get to a net zero till we don't impose penalties, till we don't impose fines on people who are adding carbon. So I think let's not delude ourselves that setting objectives without looking at the process, without looking at how we've achieved, what are the alternatives, we will not get where we want to get. And more I look at the space, I think we're trying to create a space for a product for corporate houses to control. And that's my fear point, because then this is one more thing that gets added to this whole thing of control. I can go on and on this. 4 firms control 75% of the beef slaughter market. 4 firms control 70% of the pork slaughter market. 4 firms control 53% of the chicken slaughter market. So how can you ensure that this control are dismantled? That's exactly what sovereignty movement is. How do you make sure that this is not there? Is the alternate protein manufacturers, producers talking about such things, or they're not talking about it? And where are the producers going to go? How are you going to compensate producers who are growing, who have cattle at the home, who are drinking milk from that cattle? You're not going to tell them take an alternate protein, stop having milk. And if alternate protein wants to talk about it, why do you say plant-based meat? Why don't you call it something else? People have ice cream and there's no cream in it, Why do you call it cream? Call it whatever you want to call it. I really think that's also wrong.
Thanks a lot, Ajay. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ajay. The topic is definitely getting hot now. I like that. These are the conversations we need to have. And I think this is a good segue, what you're saying, Ajay, particularly about regulations and the implementation and the process as much as the aspirational goal. Maybe it's a good segue into what I wanted to touch on, just on technology and innovation, very briefly, because then we have to go to the Q&A from the public, and there'll be closing remarks from you too as well. So one of the common points I find for us all to work on is to make a differentiation between the different types of innovation there is in the food market right now. And I particularly want to make the differentiation between alternative protein and the R&D and the innovation that is going on with that, and issues such as enteric fermentation, biogas digesters, or what else is coming out there. Because it might seem clear to us, the differentiation, but to many people from the outside, in particular decision makers, they don't see the differentiation, which means that if you are very innovation happy, often all of them are taking in, and there's a big difference between how you deal with enteric fermentation, alternative protein, or if you're very shy of innovation, I think you get the frankenfood factor. then you might actually discard good innovation points because you think it's all grouped together. So is there a way, and this is a quick question for both of you before we move into the Q&A from the public, is there a way to merge the thinking around innovation to bringing together alternative protein and food sovereignty to agree on what kinds of innovation is actually good and sustainable and affords good development and inclusivity for farmers, as opposed to the others like we find in sustainable intensification, for instance? Over to you, Varun.
Yeah, I think certainly some great points raised by Ajay as always, right? I think the issues of concentration are certainly considerable, right? I think the alternative protein landscape as it currently exists within the existing political economy of food, as Ajay was mentioning. And so a significant amount of scale is being driven by, let's say, venture capital funding and a push to scale these companies and these products. And therefore, I think what we have to do is consider interventions like, for instance, directly stipulating open access research, right? Things that do not lock in IP in ways that might also then lock in concentration. So at least at GFI globally, we are the largest funders of alternative protein research, and we stipulate open access for all of that research, right? But our grant purse is tiny relative to what amount of money should be flowing into a new space to actually make it viable on the scale that renewable energy has become viable over the last decades. So I think governments probably need to step in and also stipulate similar levels of open access around a lot of this research, right? So there isn't ownership that's being locked in. And that's just one example of a kind of intervention that could bridge this divide or bridge this, I guess, the parallel movements to make sure that, by default, we're not locking in concentration or IP ownership or things like that. That being said, I do see this as a kind of crux type issue that exists between these two movements. The reason being that I think alternative protein producers and entrepreneurs and funders, etc., are existing within the current political economy of food or the current economic paradigm. I think that's something to consider as a potential crux type, not disagreement, but something to try and resolve. And I think we need to come together and see how we could resolve that. Additionally, I think, some of the other things that Ajay mentioned, I sort of totally agree with. We definitely believe that if we're moving to, for instance, a far more efficient food production system, moving away from industrial animal agriculture that takes up something like 80% of all agricultural land, a significant portion of the land freed up should be allocated in ways that make sense, right? So, my example on Beyond Meat notwithstanding, we should be reallocating land for reforestation, afforestation, growing food for humans, regenerative agriculture, carbon capture, whatever makes sense as far as like the bouquet of land use is concerned, right? And then finally, I don't know, Lasa, if I missed out on answering any of the questions that you just asked in this quick portion of the discussion.
No, I think you covered them well and indirectly. I mean, for both of you, it would be interesting to hear if you find there is a ground for collaboration on making a differentiation between good and bad innovation, to focus on the innovation points that will actually bring benefits in terms of food systems or operations and farmer inclusivity.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add one final thing. Actually, that brought up a thought. The point about labeling of meat and whatever. I think certainly not an irreconcilable difference there. I think what's happening is essentially consumers are telling us that they want to continue eating meat, eggs, and dairy, right? And in fact, the demand for meat, eggs, and dairy is only going up, as I said at the beginning, and as even Ajay said. And the idea here is, we have to do a lot of work to make sure that from a metabolomic standpoint or a nutritional standpoint, we are matching what people might have otherwise got from a meat product. And there's work to do there, as I say, and we should be doing open access research to get to that point. But the goal is certainly to provide people with a simple switch, not a sacrifice, so that we don't need to continue this industrial animal agriculture ecosystem. So this demand seems to exist sort of in a secular way across the world. It's scaling up in the global majority nations. And people are essentially saying that they want exactly what they wanted to eat, which is the significant sensory and cultural entrenchment of meat as a prestige food and as a tasty, protein-rich, satiating product. So any replacement should essentially be a like for like replacement, at least in this generation, right? I think there's a longer term play where we might be able to replace meat's entrenchment in the cultural consciousness, but as of now, I don't think that's possible. So taste, price, accessibility, nutrition, these are factors that we're really looking to replicate. And I think how we get there is significant. So that's where we can collaborate. But what consumers are telling us is that they want plant-based meat, essentially. They don't want chickpeas instead of chicken. That's the issue.
Some quick comment from you, Ajay, before we move into the questions from the audience.
So just we cannot differentiate innovation from process. Every time we try and do that, the conflict will never end. For example, in GM crops also, the technology companies said it's an innovation. Civil society said the whole process is important. People put GM crops, and you said, and even if you were to believe the companies which gave GM crops, that it was beneficial in terms of yield coming out and of chemical inputs going down, even if you were to believe them for the sake of this discussion, but it led to more monoculture. So it is just not the innovation. You have to factor in process issues. Only then you will have a consensus on what you're looking at. But developing a consensus nowadays in this divided world, best of luck to you, Lasse, but I don't think so it's coming anytime soon. That's a hard fact. But yes, definitely we should be focusing on reduction in consumption of meat in many countries. Many countries are still not eating enough. I would not say we need to do away with it completely. My whole family, since we walked the planet, we've been having milk. I have milk every day, and it's something to say that I will not have milk is something. It's more than cultural. I think it's a part of how we have evolved over the last 10,000, 20,000 years. So I'm not against meat consumption. I think it's a part of industry. It's a part of farming, smallholder farmers' livelihood. And the last quick point is that this whole debate about health of the people and the planet is one, and then everyone ending it as a grand statement is also not going to work for the same reasons why we're looking at alternate proteins, because we need to put in the livelihoods of the stakeholders with it. So if we want a shift to happen, we need to factor in the process and how it's going to impact the livelihoods of those stakeholders who will be denied an option of their livelihoods. We have to factor that in, otherwise there'll always be conflict and we'll never reach a...
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ajay. And yeah, we were under no illusion that we would clarify the whole thing and have a kumbaya moment this morning or afternoon. But I think it's so important that we're starting this conversation and at least can agree on some of the disagreements and also see how we can potentially collaborate better in the future. So keep in mind, there will be a couple of minutes for each of you for some closing remarks. Now I want to come over to some of the questions from the audience. So let me just bring that up here. So I'm just going to ask you, I'm just going to call out one of you to answer the question, which I think is more appropriate, and also as just for a quick reply, so we can cover as many questions as possible. So the first one I want to bring up is the top one here. How do you define smallholder in Asia? Do farmers having 300 to 400 cattle, sheep counts as smallholder? Are their conditions really different from factory farms? Ajay, any thoughts on that? You're on mute, Ajay.
It's an interesting question, but I'll just give a little anecdote. I was invited to Ukraine, which is at war now. Around 7 years ago, I went there for a smallholder conference, and I don't know why they invited me, but when I went there and I asked them what is a smallholder farmer, they said anyone who owns less than 5,000 hectares of land is a smallholder. I said, I think so, nobody. And in India, a smallholder farmer is someone who has 1 hectare of land. So we cannot have a definition which is same for everyone. It would depend on the geographies of where you are. But definitely anyone with 300 to 400 cattle or sheep count, I would not find as a smallholder farmer, especially from where I come from. But yes, and it's also an incomplete question in a way. The question is not about 300 to 400 cattle. The question is how they are being reared. Also, it becomes equally, are they being grazed? or are they stall fed? Those questions also become relevant. That's why I keep coming back to the whole process needs to be low.
I think Ajay's connection just froze for a second here. So while we're waiting for him to come back, maybe Varun, the next question seems like it's quite appropriate for you. Are any of the multinationals, such as Unilever, developing smart protein divisions and products as an alternative revenue?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll make a broader statement about market development in global south or global majority countries like India, right? What's been happening is this kind of launch products for the top end of the market and look at this as an innovative space. So you'll see like plant-based meat products have come out. We've worked with the likes of Tata Consumer Products is a division of, or it's a company under the largest conglomerate in India called Tata, which is a very, very big philanthropic force in the country as well. But Tata Consumer Products has launched plant-based meat products, and those are localized products, right? So they're made in the forms of kebabs and other things. But while that is promising and interesting, and it ensures that people across the length and breadth of the country can try those products, and critically, the people who can try those products and can afford those products for now are the ones who are eating the most meat anyway. So that is a net positive. We still think that the true promise of this part of the world is in integrating backwards into the agricultural supply and advancing significant supply chain work, right? So in this part of the world, that's what we think is possible. So in terms of the potential here, we're still sort of scratching the surface, but the short answer was yes. Companies like Tata Consumer Products, ITC, even the multinationals, I don't think I can name any of them yet, but we're working with dozens of these large companies to look at launching products in this space. But again, I think there's a lot more work to do beneath that top end of the market kind of corporate story here.
Thank you so much, Varun, and welcome back, Ajay. I'll just get back to you with a question in a second. Maybe you could also then just wrap up what you wanted to say. Since we just were talking about the market now, Varun, maybe you could just cover the top question here. How do we ensure that the concentration of power does not affect the budding alternative protein movement, which is kind of like the crux of the conversation today?
Yeah, I mean, sort of what's happening here in places like India is a kind of groundswell of entrepreneurship. So these are smaller producers. So I think the scale story will necessarily involve money or venture capital funding accruing to those people and scaling up. So like I said, I think this is an incomplete story, and I think we do need to work together. I don't think we have all the answers yet, to be honest with you. So that there is significant work to do here to kind of integrate or partner with the food sovereignty movement to think through how we can create these decentralized models.
Thanks a lot, Varun. Ajay, maybe you want to just wrap up what you were saying before, and then I would also love to hear your response to the bottom question here, that reports project climate change will negatively impact animal agriculture and meat production. How to prepare the smallholder farmers for the same?
I really don't remember. I don't know when I got cut off and I got disconnected because of a bad signal. But one of the question was, is 300 to 400 cattle or sheep farm a large farmer or small farmer? I think it's a large farmer, and it's just not the cattle farm. It's even how the cattle are being bred. Are they stall fed, or are they grazing cattle? Also makes a difference on the kind of impact they have on the planet. And that differentiation is definitely there. So it's a lot of gray matter. It's not an easy thing to say, but this will vary from place to place. Like I was giving an example of landholding sizes in India and Ukraine. To the last question that you're looking at, reports project climate change will negatively impact animal agriculture, meat production in Africa and Asia. I am not so sure about it. We can climate change will impact everyone. Climate change will impact humans, it will impact animals, it will impact everyone. But definitely, it's not going to be a different impact than it's going to be impacting, let's say, rice production or wheat production or vegetable production. I think so everything gets impacted by climate change. So we cannot selectively say it will only impact animal ag or meat production. It'll impact everything.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ajay. I think we can just take one last question and then have the two of you maybe speak to that briefly, and then be ready to just give you like a couple of minutes closing remarks. So I wanted to bring up that the very huge, like, what are the impacts of the politicization of food on food systems transformation? And there's enough for a couple of PhDs there, but if you can maybe sum it up in like 1 or 2 minutes, what you think are some of the key issues you wanted to mention there, maybe starting with you, Varun. Varun, sorry, you're on mute.
So I'm actually afraid you cut out right then. So I didn't actually hear the question.
The question is the top one. What are the impacts
Okay.
of the
All right. Just wanted to
politicization of food
confirm.
and food system transformation?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm. How much time do we have? This seems like a very large question. If we have a limited amount of time and both of us are answering this question, I'd rather defer to Ajay to answer this question. This is its own panel.
It is a question for a conference by itself, of course, and very broad question. But if you had any thoughts on it, Ajay.
So what I'll do is I'll answer this question and we'll give the last word to Varun or the last 2 minutes. I'll just wind up with this question. I think if you look at in 2008, if you look at Tunisia, you look at Yemen, you look at the Arab Spring, it is all to do with inflation, price of food. And that price of food is linked to politicization of food and a systems transformation. The first priority of every country in the world initially used to be for food inflation in the developing world, but today it's an issue even in Europe and America. So I think every country plans for keeping inflation low, and especially the amount of money that a person spends from his pay packet or from his income on food, they want it reduced. And that is itself what does not allow for a transformation to take place, because it's a populist thing for governments to ensure that food is cheap. But that cheap food has a cost on the environment, on the livelihood of farmers and everyone growing it. And that's also one of the reasons that farmers are not shifting to regenerative agriculture practices, because they do not get paid the true value of food, as let's say you initially discussed. And it is all interlinked. And that's why I keep saying that in any discussion on food, on politicization or on change, discussing objectives is not enough. We need to get in the livelihoods. If we do not get in the livelihoods, there will always be a pushback. Farmers are not going to adopt better practices. So this is the politicization. It's the inflation angle. It's all governments focusing on consumers is the problem. The other thing is that with the long food value chains that have developed, with the way multilateral and corporate funding has come into the last 50 years, farmers are not growing everything they want, or not even growing most of the things they want. So even in smallholder farmers in India or in other places, are buying a lot of the things that are being transported from across continents, from across regions, through with long food miles. And this is what needs to be questioned. Can you allow for more local food production and consumption, nutrition, not even food, because when you look at food, you only talk about cereals and calories. So that is where I think it all comes in. Governments are always going to oppose anything that raises cost of food. Until you don't raise the cost of food or price of food that farmers are getting for growing price of food, I think so this transformation is not going to work out. And that's where, as a farmers organization, we differ with these larger objectives of COP27 or COP26. It's all about commitments in good English wording, but nothing comes out of it at the end of it.
A sobering way to finish on your part, Ajay. Thanks for that. And for the final words, a couple of minutes from you, Varun.
Firstly, let me say thank you once again to everyone here, Lasa, Shweta, Pavitra, everyone who's in attendance as well. This has been really interesting, and I'm glad that I was able to be a part of this conversation. I'm grateful to Ajay for all the work that he does, and always to have an opportunity to have this conversation with him. I think a couple of things emerge pretty clearly as important areas of collaboration, or at the very least to immediately integrate within the work that's going on in alternative proteins. Some of this has already been happening, but I'll start with the first one, which is I certainly believe just transitions and thinking through if there is indeed going to be a step down in industrial animal agriculture over the next 15 years, we need to start thinking about how we are kind of redistributing that income or those jobs, etc., in a very deliberate way, right? I think that once again, we cannot allow the market or creative destruction to decide what happens to people who are currently working these jobs. I should add also that a significant number of these jobs, particularly those that are inside slaughterhouses, are not the best labor conditions, not the best labor protections, issues that have come up, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, as amplification points for the pandemic in these abattoirs, etc. But certainly, just transition is very, very important to think about, and I still think we should think about potentially locating some of these technologies, especially the ones where cost basis and decentralization can be conducive, to think about including them within a kind of local production system as well, though I understand the skepticism about it. My takeaway here is, I go away from this conversation certainly re-energized to continue working on some of the things that we're working on. It is very heartening to hear that we essentially agree on some of the challenges related to the core thrust of industrialization of animal agriculture, which has happened over the last decades. And I think, the learning here, I'm definitely going to take away and start thinking through how we could work together with the food sovereignty movement. So once again, I thank you, Ajay, and everyone here for organizing. And I look forward to staying in touch on some of these things.
Thank you so much, Varun, for those words, and I very much agree. There is some ground for collaboration there, and the just livestock transition we all want to see moving towards less production and more safe production, and also production that affords better equity, gender protection, better jobs, safer jobs, as you touched on, is the way to go, and that's something that we will continue to be collaborating around. Ajay and Varun, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for your provocative thinking. It has been a pleasure having this panel, and we look very much forward to next steps, and do stay in touch as we move forward across 50 by 40, and we consider you close allies of our movement.